July 4, 1942, 2123 hours, HMS Keppel, Arctic Ocean, 78N28E. Commander Jack Broome stared at the signal in his hand, reading it 3 times because it made absolutely no tactical sense. Around him, Convoy PQ-17 to 35 merchant ships carrying 156,000 tons of war supplies to Russia steamed in tight formation under the protection of his destroyer escort group. Overhead, continuous Arctic daylight meant they'd been visible to German reconnaissance aircraft for 48 hours. Ahead, somewhere in Norwegian fjords, lurked the most powerful battleship in the German Navy. And now, the Admiralty was ordering him to abandon the convoy entirely. Most immediate, cruiser force withdraw westward at high speed. Owing to threat from surface ships, convoy is to disperse and proceed to Russian ports. Convoy is to scatter. Scatter, break formation, send 35 defenseless merchant ships sailing independently across 800 miles of ocean, known to contain long-range bombers, and possibly Tirpitz herself, a 42,000-ton battleship armed with 8 15-inch guns that could destroy merchant ships with single salvos from ranges exceeding 20 miles. Broome's first officer read the signal over his shoulder. "Sir, this is suicide. If we scatter them, they'll be picked off one by one. We should maintain formation, concentrate anti-aircraft fire, present a defensive." "I know," Broome said quietly, "but these are direct orders from the Admiralty. From the First Sea Lord himself, most likely. Then the First Sea Lord is condemning these men to death." Broome had no response, because his first officer was absolutely correct. In the next 6 days, 24 of those 35 merchant ships would be destroyed, not in a climactic battle, not facing overwhelming odds while fighting bravely, but hunted down individually, like wounded animals, torpedoed by U-boats, bombed by aircraft, machine-gunned in lifeboats, left to freeze in Arctic waters because the escorts that could have saved them had been ordered to withdraw at high speed. 153 Allied sailors would die, 430 tanks would sink to the Arctic seabed, 210 aircraft would be lost, 3,350 vehicles would never reach the Eastern Front, and the largest single convoy disaster in Allied naval history would prove that sometimes your own command kills more of your men than the enemy ever could. This is Convoy PQ-17, the story of the scatter order that turned a defended convoy into a massacre. The story of how paranoia about one German battleship destroyed an entire supply mission. The story of how Admiral Sir Dudley Pound made the worst single decision in Royal Navy history and killed 153 men who trusted their command to make rational choices. The Germans called it the greatest convoy victory of the war. The British called it the most shameful episode in Royal Navy history. Commander Jack Broome, who watched his convoy disintegrate on orders he knew would kill most of them, called it murder not by the enemy, but by our own Admiralty. And the worst part, the threat that caused the Admiralty to panic battleship Tirpitz steaming out of Norwegian fjords to massacre the convoy, even existed. Tirpitz never left port. The intelligence was wrong. 35 merchant ships were ordered to scatter and face systematic destruction based on a threat that was entirely imaginary. By the time the truth emerged, 153 men were already dead, and Admiral Pound was refusing to admit error, blaming unfortunate circumstances and enemy superiority, rather than acknowledging that his order had been the catastrophic mistake that killed them. This is how one radio signal, transmitted from London at 2123 hours on July 4, 1942, destroyed more Allied merchant ships than the German Navy sank in any other Arctic convoy operation combined. This is how command failure kills more efficiently than enemy action. And this is how 153 sailors died, not because the enemy was too strong, but because their own leadership was too panicked to think clearly. Convoy PQ-17 was not sunk by the Germans, it was destroyed by the Admiralty. Commander Jack Broome, HMS Keppel, 1942, Part 1. The Arctic. Lifeline 1941, 1942. The Russian convoys. Begin. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, Britain and the Soviet Union became unlikely allies by necessity. Churchill, who had spent decades opposing communism, now faced the reality that Soviet survival was essential to defeating Nazi Germany. If Russia fell, Hitler would control resources from the Atlantic to the Ural, making Allied victory nearly impossible. The Soviet Union needed supplies, desperately tanks to replace those destroyed in the German invasion, aircraft to contest Luftwaffe air superiority, vehicles to move troops and supplies, raw materials to sustain war production, food to feed armies and civilians. Britain and America committed to providing those supplies through the Lend-Lease program, but delivering them to Russia presented enormous logistical challenges. The Mediterranean route was too dangerous. German and Italian forces controlled North Africa and could interdict shipping. The Trans-Pacific route was too slow. Supplies had to travel from American ports to then be transported thousands of miles across the Trans-Siberian Railway that left the Arctic route. Convoys sailing from Britain and Iceland to Murmansk and Archangel in northern Russia. The route was relatively short, about 2,000 miles, but extraordinarily dangerous. The threats were multiple and severe. Geography. The route passed through narrow waters between Norway, German-occupied, and the Arctic ice pack, forcing convoys into a geographic funnel where German forces could concentrate attacks. Whether Arctic conditions meant extreme cold, violent storms, ice formation on ships that could capsize them if not removed, fog that prevented visual navigation, and continuous daylight in summer making convoys visible 24 hours, or continuous darkness in winter making navigation treacherous. German forces. Norway's airfields hosted bomber and torpedo aircraft squadrons. Norwegian fjords sheltered U-boats and surface warships, including Tirpitz, the most powerful battleship in the German Navy. German forces could attack convoys with aircraft, submarines, and surface ships simultaneously. Despite these threats, the Arctic convoys had to sail. Soviet survival depended on Western supplies. Between August 1941 and May 1942, 12 convoys designated PQ-1 through PQ-16 had delivered supplies to Russia with varying degrees of success. Losses had been mounting. PQ-13 March 1942, 5 of 19 merchant ships sunk. 15 May 1942, 3 of 25 ships. SUNK PQ-16 May 1942, 7 of 35 ships sunk. The trend was ominous. German anti-shipping capabilities in Norway were increasing. Aircraft squadrons were being reinforced. More U-boats were deployed. And Tirpitz, the ultimate threat, sat in Trondheim Fjord, capable of sorting to massacre any convoy it encountered. But the supplies had to keep flowing. In June 1942, Stalin sent urgent messages demanding more aid. The Eastern Front was consuming men and material at catastrophic rates. Soviet forces needed Western supplies to maintain resistance against German offensives. The Admiralty reluctantly approved Convoy PQ-174, early July 1942. Despite severe misgivings about sending merchant ships into Arctic waters during continuous daylight, when German reconnaissance could track them constantly, the convoy would be the largest. Yet, 35 merchant ships, 156,000 tons of cargo, 430 tanks to 10 aircraft, 3,350 vehicles, 99,316 tons of general military supplies. Estimated value, $700 million, $1,942, approximately $12 billion in modern terms. It would also be the most heavily escorted Arctic convoy yet assembled, with multiple destroyer squadrons, corvettes, anti-aircraft ships, submarines, and a distant covering force of cruisers and battleships. Everything possible was being done to ensure PQ-17's survival, except for one critical element, ensuring that commanders 2,000 miles away in London wouldn't make catastrophically bad decisions based on flawed intelligence and strategic panic. That oversight would kill 153 men. Part 2. The formation, June 27, 1942, Iceland. The merchant ships of Convoy PQ-17 assembled in Hvalfjordur, deepwater anchorage in western Iceland, that served as the staging point for Arctic convoys. The ships came from Britain, America, and Allied nations, crewed by merchant sailors who knew they were about to sail into some of the most dangerous waters in the world. The merchant vessels varied widely. American Liberty ships, mass-produced cargo vessels. British cargo freighters, Panamanian-flagged vessels, Dutch and Norwegian merchant ships operating under Allied control. Total 35 merchant ships, plus one rescue ship, Zamalek, assigned to pick up survivors from vessels that were sunk. The crews were civilian merchant mariners, not military personnel. They were paid wages, not military salaries. They could technically refuse to sail on dangerous voyages, though few did. They wore no uniforms, carried no weapons, and had no combat training. When their ships were torpedoed, they couldn't fire back. They could only abandon ship and hope for rescue. Their mortality rate during World War II would exceed 25% higher than any military branch except submarine service. Merchant mariners died from torpedoes, bombs, strafing, hypothermia, starvation in lifeboats, and sheer bad luck. They received no military honors, no campaign medals, no veterans' benefits after the war, but they kept sailing, because supplies had to reach their destinations, because someone had to crew the ships that kept Britain fed and Russia supplied, because refusing meant cargo didn't move and wars couldn't be won. Among PQ-17's merchant captains, several would become central to this story. Captain Jack Dowding, SS River Afton, a 48-year-old career merchant officer with 25 years' experience. He had survived 2 torpedo attacks on previous convoys and understood Arctic warfare intimately. He would keep a detailed diary during PQ-17's voyage, document that would later serve as devastating evidence of what happened when the Please Scatter order was issued. Captain John Wharton, SS Daniel Morgan, American Liberty ship, a former U.S. Navy officer who had transferred to merchant service, technically a civilian, but with military training and combat experience. He would make critical tactical decisions during the scatter that would save his ship and crew. Captain Salvesen, SS Troubadour, Norwegian captain whose ship was carrying a particularly valuable cargo. Hawker Hurricane fighters partially assembled for quick activation upon arrival in Russia. Losing Troubadour would mean losing aircraft desperately needed by Soviet air forces. These men and 32 other merchant captains trusted that the Royal Navy would protect them, that convoy tactics proven over 3 years of Atlantic warfare would be followed, that orders from the Admiralty would be rational and tactically sound, that trust would be betrayed. Catastrophic Ally. Part 3. The Escort Force, June 27–30, 1942. The escorts assemble. Protecting Convoy PQ-17 would be the largest escort force ever assigned to an Arctic convoy. Close escort under Commander Jack Broome. HMS Keppel, 6 destroyers for corvettes, 3 minesweepers for armed trawlers, 2 anti-aircraft ships, 2 submarines, cruiser, covering force Rear Admiral Louis Hamilton, 4 cruisers, HMS London, Norfolk, USS Wichita, USS Tuscaloosa, 3 destroyers, distant covering force, Admiral Sir John Tovey, Commander-in-Chief, Home Fleet, Battleship H. Duke of York aircraft carrier HMS Victorious, Battleship USS Washington, 2 cruisers, multiple destroyer, screens, total military vessels, over 50 warships assigned to protect 35 merchant ships. The defensive plan was layered. Close escort would accompany the convoy directly, providing anti-submarine and anti-aircraft defense. Cruiser force would shadow the convoy at distance, ready to engage any German surface ships that approached. Distinct covering force would remain further west, positioned to intercept Tirpitz if she sortied from Norway. Commander Jack Broome, commanding the close escort from HMS Keppel, was an experienced destroyer captain who understood Arctic convoy operations intimately. He had escorted PQ-16 successfully, despite losing 7 merchant ships to air attack. He knew the threats, knew the tactics, knew that the key to survival was maintaining tight formation and concentrated defensive fire. He also knew that the greatest threat wasn't U-boats or aircraft, it was Tirpitz. The German battleship, sitting in Trondheim Fjord, represented an existential threat to any Arctic convoy. Armed with 8 15-inch guns and capable of 30 knots speed, Tirpitz could overtake any convoy, destroy escorts with long-range gunfire, and systematically slaughter merchant ships with impunity. No convoy escort force could stop her. Only the distant covering force, with battleships Duke of York and Washington, had any chance of engaging Tirpitz on equal terms. The Admiralty's greatest fear was that Tirpitz would sortie undetected, reach the convoy before the distant covering force could intercept, and massacre the entire formation. That fear, rational but poorly managed, would drive the catastrophic decisions that followed. Part 4. The voyage begins June 27, July 1, 1942. Iceland to Bear Island. Convoy PQ-17 departed HVL Fjord on June 27, sailing northeast. Bear Island, a desolate speck of rock halfway between Norway and Spitsbergen, that marked the convoy's northernmost waypoint before turning southeast toward Russia. The first 3 days passed relatively quietly. Weather was good to good. Clear skies and calm seas meant perfect visibility, which favored German reconnaissance aircraft. The convoy was spotted on June 30th by long-range Focke-Wulf Condor patrol bombers operating from Norwegian airfields. Once spotted, the convoy could never again be hidden. Continuous Arctic daylight meant 24-hour visibility. German reconnaissance aircraft shadowed the convoy constantly, reporting its position, course, speed, and composition. The element of surprise was gone. July 1st, first air attacks began. Heinkel, He-111 torpedo bombers and Junkers, Ruati-8 bombers struck in waves. The close escort's anti-aircraft fire was intense, and effective aircraft were driven off without sinking any ships. But the attacks confirmed what everyone knew. German forces were concentrating against PQ-17. July 2nd, more air attacks. More aircraft driven off. One merchant ship damaged, but still operational. The convoy maintained formation. Concentrated defensive fire continued working. Morale among merchant crews remained relatively good. They were scared but confident that the escort was protecting them effectively. July 3rd, intelligence reports reached the Admiralty in London. Accompanied by heavy cruiser Admiral Hipper and several destroyers, had been observed moving from Trondheim Fjord to Alten Fjord closer to PQ-17's route. German surface forces were positioning for possible attack. This intelligence, though accurate, was misinterpreted in the worst possible way. Part 5. The decision. July 4th, 1942, 1800 to 2100 hours. Admiralty Operations Room, London. First, Sea Lord Admiral Sir Dudley Pound presided over the Admiralty War Room, monitoring PQ-17's progress on large plotting tables showing the convoy's position, known German forces, and estimated threat levels. Pound was 65 years old, in declining health, suffering from undiagnosed brain tumor that would kill him within 14 months. He was exhausted from years of wartime command responsibility, working 16-hour days, making life-or-death decisions constantly. His judgment, never perfect, was deteriorating under medical conditions he didn't know he had. At 1800 hours, new intelligence arrived. Tirpitz and accompanying warships had been observed leaving Altenfjord, heading north. Course and speed suggested they might be moving to intercept PQ-17. Pound studied the plot. The convoy was approximately 200 miles northeast of Bear Island. If Tirpitz had indeed sorted to intercept, she could reach the convoy within 6 to 8 hours. The cruiser covering force couldn't stop her. Tirpitz's 15-inch guns outranged cruiser 8-inch guns by significant margins. The distant covering force with battleships Duke of York and Washington was too far west to intercept in time. One of Pound's staff officers suggested waiting for confirmation. "Sir, the sighting report isn't definitive. Tirpitz might be conducting exercises or repositioning defensively. We should verify before taking action." "We can't afford to wait," Pound said. "If Tirpitz reaches that convoy before Duke of York can intercept, she massacre every ship. I need to act on the assumption that she's coming." "What action do you propose, sir?" Pound made the decision that would kill 153 men. Order the cruiser force to withdraw westward at high speed. Order the convoy to scatter. The room went silent. Several staff officers exchanged glances. No one wanted to be the first to speak, but everyone understood the implications. Finally, Captain Frederick Dalrymple Hamilton, representing the naval staff, spoke carefully. "Sir, if we order the convoy to scatter, they'll be defenseless. Individual merchant ships can't defend against air attack or submarines. The escorts provide concentrated anti-aircraft fire and submarine defense. Without escorts, the merchant ships will be picked off one by one." "I'm aware of that," Pound said. "But if Tirpitz reaches them in formation, she'll destroy them all anyway. At least if they scatter, some might escape." "Sir, we don't have confirmation that Tirpitz has actually sortied. The reconnaissance report was ambiguous. If we scatter the convoy based on unconfirmed intelligence, draft the orders," Pound interrupted. "The cruiser force is to withdraw westward immediately. The convoy is to disperse and proceed independently to Russian ports." At 2111 hours, the first signal was transmitted. "Most immediate. Cruiser force withdraw westward at high speed." At 2123 hours, The second signal followed. Owing to threat from surface ships, convoy is to disperse and proceed to Russian ports. At 2136 hours, a third signal clarified the urgency. Convoy is to scatter. Those three signals, transmitted over 25 minutes, sealed the fate of Convoy PQ-17. Part 6. The scattered July 4, 2123 to 2400 hours. Convoy PQ-17, Arctic Ocean. When the signals reached HMS Keppel, Commander Broome couldn't believe what he was reading. He showed the messages to his officers, hoping someone could explain how the orders made tactical sense. No one could. "This is insane," his first officer said. "If we scatter them, they'll be slaughtered." Broome agreed, but orders were orders, and they came from the Admiralty with most immediate priority. He had no authority to disregard them, no matter how catastrophically wrong he believed them to be. He drafted a signal to the merchant ship Commodore, the senior merchant captain coordinating the convoy's formation. Most immediate, convoy is to scatter. Proceed independently to Russian ports at best speed. Then he gave the order that haunted him for the rest of his life. All escorts, set course 270 degrees, speed 25 knots. We're abandoning the convoy. On the merchant ships, confusion and terror spread as crews watched their escorts suddenly turn west and steam away at high speed. Without explanation, without coordination, the protective screen that had kept them alive for 7 days was vanishing over the horizon. Captain Jack Dowding of SS River Afton recorded the moment in his diary. 2130 hours. Escorts have withdrawn. No explanation. Merchant ships are now alone, scattered across 50 square miles of ocean, with no defense against submarines or aircraft. I can see 3 U-boats on the surface, shadowing us openly because they know we can't fight back. We are being murdered systematically. The merchant ships scattered in different directions, each captain making individual decisions about course and speed based on limited information and desperation. Some captains steamed southeast at maximum speed, trying to reach Russian ports quickly. Some headed north toward the ice pack, hoping to hide among ice floes. Some attempted to stay in small groups, hoping concentrated anti-aircraft fire might still work. Some simply maintained eastward course, trusting that Russian ports couldn't be more than 700 miles away. Of these, choices would prove adequate, because waiting for them were 8 U-boats positioned across the convoy's route, multiple squadrons of torpedo bombers and dive bombers, 6 full days of continuous Arctic daylight, 700 miles of ocean with nowhere to hide. The systematic destruction was about to begin. Part 7. The first kills July 5, 1942, 02:0012:00 hours. The first merchant ship died at 02:45 hours. SS Navarino, struggling with engine problems that reduced her speed, was overtaken by U-334. Captain Lieutenant Hilmar Seaman surfaced his submarine, close to 2,000 yards, and fired 2 torpedoes. Both struck Navarino amid. The ship sank in 4 minutes. Her crew abandoned ship in lifeboats, watching their vessel disappear beneath Arctic waters. The rescue ship, which had remained with the scattered merchant vessels against orders, picked up Navarino's survivors. But Zamalek couldn't rescue everyone. She had limited capacity and couldn't remain stationary in U-boat-infested waters. At 05:20 hours, SS Coltonan, American Liberty ship, carrying tanks and vehicles, was torpedoed by U-88. The explosion was catastrophic. The cargo of tanks broke loose and crushed through bulkheads. Carlton capsized and sank in less than 3 minutes. Of her 47-man crew, only 23 reached lifeboats. The others went down with the ship. At 07:40 hours, SS Washington, another American Liberty ship, was attacked by 3 junkers, WWII, 8 bombers. With no escort protection and no nearby ships to provide concentrated anti-aircraft fire, Washington's single 4-inch deck gun was inadequate. 2 bombs struck the vessel. The first hit the forward hold, detonating ammunition stored there. The explosion tore the bow off completely. The second bomb struck the engine room, killing the engineers instantly and breaking the ship's back. Washington sank in 6 minutes. 31 crew members died. 16 survived in lifeboats. By noon on July 5, less than 12 hours after the scatter order, 7 merchant ships had been destroyed. 57 sailors were dead. Hundreds more were in lifeboats or on the rescue ship, traumatized, hypothermic, and watching other merchant vessels die around them. Captain Dowding of River Afton wrote in his diary, "We are scattered across the Arctic like sheep, with wolves among us. I have counted 11 ships sunk since yesterday evening. The U-boats surface openly during attacks because they know we cannot defend ourselves. The aircraft circle overhead, selecting targets at leisure. I have seen men machine-gunned in lifeboats. I have seen ships explode and sink in minutes. We have perhaps 500 miles still to travel. At this rate, none of us will reach Russia alive." Part 8. The Systematic Destruction, July 5 to 10, 1942, Arctic Ocean. The next 5 days were methodical slaughter. German forces and aircraft working in coordination down scattered merchant ships with brutal efficiency. The tactics were simple and devastating. 1. Reconnaissance. Aircraft located scattered merchant ships. 2. Position reports were radioed to U-boats and bomber squadrons. 3. U-boats and aircraft converged on reported positions. 4. Attacks were pressed without opposition. The merchant ships had no defense. Their deck guns were designed for deterrence, not combat, against surfaced U-boats at 2,000 plus yards or aircraft diving from altitude. The single 4-inch or 5-inch guns were useless. The merchant crews were civilian sailors, not trained gunners. They did their best, but best wasn't enough. The ships destroyed, day by day. July 5th, SS Navarino torpedoed SS Carleton, torpedoed SS Washington, bombed S. Pancraft torpedoed SS Earlston, bombed S. Bolton Castle torpedoed S. Peter Kerr bombed July 6th SS Paulus Potter, torpedoed SS John Witherspoon, torpedoed SS Fairfield City, bombed SS Honolulu, torpedoed S. Pan Atlantic bombed July 7th, SS Alcoa Ranger, bombed SS Olopana, torpedoed SS Hoosier, bombed and torpedoed July 8th, SS El Capitan torpedoed SS Samuel Chase, bombed S. Christopher Newport torpedoed July 9th, SS Hartlebury torpedoed SS Aldersdale, bombed July 10th, SS Azerbaijan torpedoed SS Bellingham, torpedoed, total destroyed 24 merchant ships, total cargo lost 99,316 tons, tanks lost 430, aircraft lost 210, vehicles lost 3,350, sailors killed 153, value of cargo approximately $700 million, $1,942. Each sinking had its own horror. SS Hoosier was bombed first, then torpedoed while crew members were abandoning ship. 13 men died, some from the initial attack, others from hypothermia when their lifeboat capsized in the Arctic water. SS Bellingham survived for days after the scatter, only to be torpedoed on July 10th, just 50 miles from the Novaya Zemlya coast. Her crew could see land when the torpedo struck. All hands were lost when the ship sank in less than 2 minutes in shallow water near shore. SS Pan Atlantic was strafed by German aircraft after being bombed. Survivors in lifeboats were machine-gunned, deliberately. 6 men died from gunfire wounds, not from the sinking itself, a war crime that would never be prosecuted. The survivors who reached lifeboats faced Arctic conditions, water temperatures of D-35 degrees Fahrenheit, air temperatures barely above freezing, continuous daylight that prevented hiding, and the psychological trauma of watching ship after ship explode and sink while knowing they could be next. Hypothermia claimed victims slowly, first the shivering, then the confusion and disorientation, then the drowsiness, finally the quiet slipping into unconsciousness and death. Men who survived the sinkings died in lifeboats waiting for rescue that sometimes took days to arrive. It arrived at all. Part 9. The survivors who defied orders. All merchant captains obeyed the scatter order completely. A few, through tactical skill, luck, or deliberate rule-breaking, managed to save their ships and crews. The Northern Group 11 merchant ships captains, Wharton, Daniel Morgan, Rugg, Troubadour, Caraway, Silver Sword, and 8 others made a critical decision. Ignore the scatter order's directive to proceed independently, and instead form a small convoy that steamed north into the ice pack. Their reasoning was sound. Yes, ice was dangerous. Ships could be trapped, crushed by ice pressure, or sunk if they struck ice at speed. But ice would also prevent U-boat operations. Submarines couldn't dive or maneuver in ice-choked waters. Ice would limit aircraft operations. Bombers couldn't see targets through ice fog and low clouds that accompanied pack ice. It was gambling on death by freezing over death by torpedo. They chose correctly. The northern group pushed north until ice floes surrounded them on all sides. For 3 days, they moved slowly through gaps in the ice, sometimes stationary for hours when ice closed around them, always watching for German aircraft and listening for U-boat engines. On July 6, they received a miracle. Dense fog rolled in from the ice pack, reducing visibility to less than 100 yards. The fog persisted for 48 hours, long enough for the group to transit the most dangerous waters while invisible to German reconnaissance. On July 11, the northern group emerged from the ice pack near Novye Zemlya and proceeded to Archangel under cover of Soviet air patrols. All 11 ships arrived safely with their cargo intact. Captain John Wharton's after-action report stated, "We disobeyed the scatter order by maintaining group formation. We risked destruction by ice rather than certain destruction by U-boats and aircraft. We believe these decisions saved our ships and crews. We regret nothing." The Admiralty quietly chose not to reprimand any of the northern group captains. Acknowledging their disobedience would require acknowledging that the scatter order had been wrong. Part 10. The Truth About Tirpitz, July 5, 1942. Altenfjord, Norway. While Convoy PQ-17's merchant ships were being systematically destroyed, battleship Tirpitz sat quietly at anchor in Altenfjord. She had moved there from Trondheim. On July 3, a routine repositioning to a more forward base. On July 5, Tirpitz and accompanying heavy cruisers did sortie briefly, not to attack PQ-17, but to conduct a reconnaissance sweep. German Naval Command wanted to assess whether British heavy units were in the area before committing to a convoy attack. At 18:30 hours on July 5, while merchant ships were already scattered and dying German reconnaissance, aircraft spotted the British covering force, battleships Duke of York and Washington, southwest of the convoy, facing 2 enemy battleships. Admiral Otto Schneewind, commanding the German squadron, immediately ordered withdrawal to Altenfjord. Tirpitz returned to port. She never came within 400 miles of Convoy PQ-17. The threat that had caused Admiral Pound to panic and order the scatter had never materialized. The intelligence timeline revealed the tragedy. July 4, 2100 hours. Pound orders scatter based on intelligence that Tirpitz might be sortie Ingeli 5, 1800 hours. Tirpitz briefly sorties but immediately withdraws after detecting British battleships. July 5, 2000 hours. Tirpitz returns to Altenfjord anchorage. July 6, 800 hours. British intelligence confirms Tirpitz is back in port and never approached the convoy by the time the Admiralty learned. Tirpitz had never threatened PQ-17. 20 merchant ships were already destroyed and it was too late to save the others. The scatter order had been based on a threat that existed only in Admiral Pound's imagination and flawed intelligence assessment. Part 11. The Aftermath, July 11 to 28, 1942, Archangel and Murmansk. Of Convoy PQ-17's 35 merchant ships, only 11 reached Russian ports. 10 arrived at Archangel, mostly the northern group that had disobeyed orders. 1 arrived at Murmansk after hiding near Novye Zemlya for days. The cargo delivered was approximately 1/3 of what had departed. Iceland, tanks delivered 164 of 430, 38% aircraft, delivered 87 of 210, 41% vehicles, delivered 896 of 3,350, 27% human cost, 153 merchant sailors killed, hundreds more suffering from hypothermia, injuries, psychological trauma, strategic cost, Soviet offensives delayed or cancelled due to equipment shortages, trust in British commitments severely damaged, German propaganda celebrating the greatest convoy victory of the war, political cost, Churchill personally apologizing to Stalin for the disaster, lied merchant seamen refusing to volunteer for Arctic convoy duty, morale crisis in the merchant marine requiring pay increases and benefits to restore willingness to sail. The British government tried to minimize the disaster through careful public relations. Convoy PQ-17 encountered heavy enemy opposition including surface ships, submarines, and aircraft. Despite determined defense by escorts, regrettable losses occurred. Investigation into tactical circumstances is ongoing. That bland statement concealed the truth. The losses were not due to heavy enemy opposition, but to catastrophically bad decision-making by the Admiralty. Part 12. The 1942, Admiralty investigation. The investigation into PQ-17's destruction was conducted quietly, with findings classified to avoid public scandal. The conclusions were damning. 1. The scatter order was premature and based on unconfirmed intelligence. The intelligence that Tirpitz was sorting to attack the convoy was ambiguous. Pound ordered the scatter without waiting for confirmation, without consulting officers closer to the situation, and without considering alternative responses. 2. The scatter order contradicted established convoy defense doctrine. Years of Atlantic convoy experience had proven that concentrated formations with coordinated escort defense were far more effective than dispersal. The scatter order threw away every tactical lesson learned since 1939.3. The cruiser force withdrawal left the convoy defense. The cruiser force to withdraw at high speed removed the only ships capable of engaging surfaced U-boats effectively. Even if cruisers couldn't stop Tirpitz, they could have destroyed U-boats and provided defense for the distant covering. Force was positioned too far from the convoy battle. Duke of York and Washington were supposed to intercept Tirpitz if she sought it, but they were positioned 400+ miles from the convoy, too far to intervene in time. The defensive plan was fundamentally flawed. 5. Admiral Pound's decision-making showed impaired judgment. Multiple staff officers had questioned the scatter order, but Pound had overruled all objections. His decision-making appeared rushed, panicked, and disconnected from tactical reality. The investigation report recommended Arctic convoys should sail only during winter darkness. Periods convoy defense doctrine should never be abandoned based on unconfirmed intelligence. Distant covering forces should be positioned closer to convoys. No mention was made of Admiral Pound's personal culpability. The last point was politically convenient. Pound was First Sea Lord, and admitting his error would undermine confidence in Royal Navy leadership at a critical point in the war. But Commander Jack Broome, who had watched the disaster unfold from HMS Keppel, was less diplomatic. In his personal account published after the war, he wrote, "The scatter order was the most disgraceful episode in Royal Navy history. Admiral Pound murdered those merchant sailors as surely as if he had torpedoed them himself. He panicked, made a catastrophically bad decision, and then refused to admit error, even after the truth emerged. 153 men died because one admiral couldn't think clearly under pressure. That is unforgivable." Part 13. Admiral Pound's final year: July 1942, September 1943. Admiral Sir Dudley Pound continued as First Sea Lord for another 14 months after PQ-17's destruction. During that time, he never publicly acknowledged that the scatter order had been an error. His official statements maintained that the decision had been regrettable but necessary given intelligence available at the time. But privately, Pound was deteriorating rapidly. The undiagnosed brain tumor was causing increasing impairment, headaches, confusion, episodes of disorientation, difficulty processing complex information. His staff noticed he often fell asleep during meetings, a symptom of the neurological damage occurring. In August 1943, Pound collapsed during a conference in Quebec. Medical examination revealed the brain tumor. He resigned as First Sea Lord on September 20, 1943, and died on October 21, Trafalgar Day. Ironically appropriate for a Royal Navy admiral, his obituaries praised his decades of naval service, his leadership during wartime, his dedication to duty. They mentioned PQ-17 only briefly, describing it as a convoy operation that encountered heavy losses despite determined defense. The survivors of PQ-17 read those obituaries with bitter feelings. The admiral who had condemned 153 of their comrades to death was being celebrated as a hero, while the truth about his catastrophic decision remained classified. Captain Jack Dowding, survivor from SS River Afton, wrote in his diary, "Admiral Pound died today. I feel no satisfaction in this. A sick man made a terrible decision that killed good men, but he was still a man, flawed and failing, trying to carry burden no one should bear alone. I am angry at what he did, but I cannot celebrate his death. The dead do not return because their killer has joined them." Part 14. Stalin's reaction: July-August 1942. Moscow. Joseph Stalin's response to PQ-17's destruction was immediate and furious. He sent a message to Churchill suggesting that British incompetence in protecting the convoy was so severe that it raised questions about whether Britain truly supported the Soviet war effort. The implication was clear. Stalin suspected deliberate sabotage. He couldn't believe that any naval command could make decisions as catastrophically bad as ordering a convoy to scatter unless they wanted it. Destroyed. Churchill responded with unusual personal humility. The loss of Convoy PQ-17 is a naval disaster for which I bear ultimate responsibility as Prime Minister. The decision to scatter the convoy was made by our naval command based on intelligence about German surface ships. This decision proved incorrect. I deeply regret the loss of supplies your forces needed, and the loss of brave merchant sailors who were attempting to deliver them. Britain remains committed to supporting Soviet resistance against Nazi aggression. Stalin was not satisfied. He demanded that future convoys receive better protection, or that Britain find alternative routes to deliver supplies. The Arctic convoy program was suspended for the remainder of summer 1942, exactly what the PQ-17 disaster had forced. Convoys resumed in September 1942 with dramatically increased escort forces and revised tactics, but the damage to Anglo-Soviet trust was lasting. Throughout the remainder of the war, Stalin maintained suspicion that British military leadership was incompetent at best, or deliberately undermining Soviet interests at worst. The propaganda value for Germany was enormous. German radio broadcasts celebrated the destruction of English convoy PQ-17 by superior German naval and air forces. The broadcasts didn't mention that most merchant ships were destroyed after British forces had abandoned them. That truth was less useful for propaganda purposes. Part 15. The survivors speak post-war accounts from PQ-17 survivors. Commander Jack Broome, HMS Keppel. I have commanded destroyers in combat for 4 years. I have made difficult decisions under fire. I have lost men under my command, but nothing in my career compares to the horror of receiving the scatter order and absolutely knowing that it would get most of those merchant sailors killed. I followed orders because I had no authority to disobey them, but I will never forgive the Admiralty for issuing them. Admiral Pound murdered those men as surely as if he had fired the torpedoes himself. The Germans just pulled the trigger on the gun he loaded. Captain Jack Dowding, SS River Afton. I watched 11 ships sink over 2 days. I saw men machine-gunned in lifeboats. I saw ships explode and disappear in minutes. I saw young men, boys, really, 18 and 19 years old, die terrified and alone in Arctic waters because their own command had abandoned them. We trusted the Royal Navy to protect us. They scattered us like sheep for wolves to slaughter. I am not bitter toward the Germans. They were enemies, doing what enemies do. I am bitter toward the Admiralty, which failed in its fundamental duty to protect merchant sailors delivering supplies their nation needed. Captain John Wharton, SS Daniel Morgan. I disobeyed the scatter order by staying with other merchant ships and heading north into the ice. I risked court-martial by doing so. I would do it again without hesitation. The scatter order was insane. Any merchant captain with experience knew that dispersing made us defenseless. I chose to trust my judgment over Admiralty orders, and that choice saved my ship and crew. I regret only that more captains didn't do the same. Able seaman Robert Hughes, SS Empire Byron sunk, July 5th. I was 19 years old. It was my second voyage. I was standing watch when the torpedo hit. I remember the explosion, the cold water, the darkness as the ship sank under me. I remember swimming in my life vest, watching my ship disappear, wondering if rescue would come before hypothermia killed me. Zamalek picked me up 6 hours later. By then I couldn't feel my hands or feet. I was hallucinating, seeing things that weren't there. I survived, but 12 of my shipmates didn't. They died because someone in London made a bad decision. That's the part I can't reconcile. They didn't die fighting bravely or facing overwhelming odds. They died because their own side abandoned them. Part 16. The long-term impact. PQ-17's destruction had strategic consequences that extended far beyond the immediate loss of ships and cargo. 1. Arctic convoy. Operations suspended until winter 1942. The disaster convinced the Admiralty that summer Arctic convoys were too dangerous. Operations resumed only in September, when continuous darkness provided some concealment. Soviet forces went without Western supplies during critical summer months. 2. Convoy defense doctrine was revised. Never again would a convoy be ordered to scatter based on potential threats. The principle of concentrated defense with coordinated escort forces became absolute doctrine. PQ-17 became a cautionary case study in what never to do. 3. Merchant marine recruitment and retention problems. Merchant sailors who survived PQ-17 spread stories throughout the merchant marine about being abandoned by naval escorts. Recruitment for Arctic convoy duty became difficult. Pay and benefits had to be substantially increased to maintain volunteer levels. 4. Anglo-Soviet relations were damaged. Stolen suspicion of British competence and commitment persisted throughout the war. The PQ-17 disaster contributed to tensions that would eventually develop into the Cold War. 5. German confidence in Arctic operations increased. The success against PQ-17 encouraged German naval and air forces to believe they could destroy future convoys. This led to concentration of forces in Norway that might otherwise have been deployed elsewhere. 6. Political pressure to never repeat PQ-17. Churchill personally ordered that future Arctic convoys receive maximum protection. This forced diversion of naval assets from other theaters, affecting operations in the Atlantic and Mediterranean. Part 17. The Forgotten Victims. Beyond the 153 merchant sailors who died, PQ-17's destruction had other victims whose stories are often overlooked. The rescue ship crews, Zamelek, and other rescue vessels operated under orders to pick up survivors, but couldn't remain stationary in dangerous waters. Rescue ship crews watched helplessly as some survivors in lifeboats drifted out of range or died before rescue could arrive. The psychological burden of watching men die while being unable to save them traumatized rescue crews for years. The escort crews, destroyer and corvette sailors who had escorted the convoy for days, developing relationships with merchant sailors, were forced to abandon them and steam away at high speed. Many escort crew members reported nightmares for years afterward, dreams of merchant sailors calling for help while they sailed away. The families, 153. Families received telegrams informing them that husbands, sons, fathers were missing in action, presumed lost at sea. Because merchant sailors weren't military personnel, their families received no military benefits, no pensions, no formal recognition of sacrifice. Many families faced financial hardship after losing their breadwinner. The Soviet forces, Soviet tank crews, aircraft pilots, and infantry who went into combat without equipment that sank with PQ-17. Historians estimate that absence of PQ-17's supplies contributed to thousands of Soviet casualties in summer 1942. Offensives that failed partially from equipment shortages. The political leaders, Churchill, personally felt responsible for PQ-17's failure and wrote extensively about it in his memoirs. The disaster weighed on him. Representing a failure of the naval command structure, he was ultimately responsible for overseeing. Part 18. The lessons. Never learned. Despite PQ-17's clear lessons, similar command failures occurred throughout the war. Dieppe, August 1942. Poor planning and flawed intelligence led to catastrophic losses. 68% casualty rate among Canadian Forces. Operation Market Garden, September 1944. Overconfidence and ignored intelligence resulted in British 1st Airborne Division's destruction at Arnhem. Battle of Hurtgen Forest, September-December 1944. Continued attacks despite futility caused 33% casualty rates with no strategic gain. The pattern was consistent. Senior commanders making decisions based on flawed intelligence, wishful thinking, or strategic panic. Frontline troops paying the price. Post-action reports whitewashing failures to protect command reputation. PQ-17 should have taught military leadership that intelligence must be confirmed before making irreversible decisions. Tactical doctrine exists for good reasons and shouldn't be abandoned in panic distance. Commanders must trust officers closer to the situation. Admitting errors is essential for learning and improvement. Those lessons were documented, studied in staff colleges, and then ignored when similar situations arose, because institutional cultures prioritize protecting command authority over acknowledging mistakes. The same patterns repeat across different conflicts. Conclusion: the order that killed 153 men. Convoy PQ-17's destruction wasn't a military defeat in conventional terms. It was a command failure of spectacular magnitude, a single bad decision made by one admiral in London that killed 153 merchant sailors and destroyed $700 million in war supplies. The mathematics were brutal. 24 merchant ships destroyed 69% of convoy. 153 sailors killed approximately 7% of all personnel on merchant ships. 99,316 tons of cargo lost. 64% of what departed Iceland. 430 tanks never reached Soviet forces. 210 aircraft never flew combat missions. 3,350 vehicles rusted on the Arctic. See Badal of this because Admiral Sir Dudley Pound panicked about a threat that never materialized, issued an order that contradicted established doctrine, and refused to admit error even after the truth emerged. The fundamental tragedy: the men didn't die fighting bravely against overwhelming odds. They died because their own command abandoned them. Commander Jack Broome's assessment remains the definitive judgment. PQ-17 was not defeated by German superiority. It was destroyed by Admiralty incompetence. The scatter order was military malpractice of the worst kind, ordering defenseless civilian ships to sail independently through waters known to contain enemy submarines and aircraft. Every merchant sailor who died is on Admiral Pound's conscience, and I hope it haunted him for the brief time he lived after making that decision. The survivors who reached Russia delivered 1/3 of the supplies that had departed Iceland. Soviet forces used those supplies in desperate combat against German offensives. The 164 tanks, 87 aircraft, and 896 vehicles that arrived made differences in battles, saved Soviet lives, contributed to eventual victory. But the 430 tanks, 210 aircraft, and 3,350 vehicles that sank represented Soviet soldiers who fought without equipment they needed, battles lost that might have been won, offensives cancelled because supplies never arrived, and the 153 men who died represented husbands who never came home, fathers whose children grew up without them, sons whose mothers received telegrams with devastating news, and sailors whose final moments were terror and cold and the certain knowledge that they had been abandoned. From Captain Jack Dowding's final diary entry, written August 1942, after returning to Britain: I survived PQ-17 by luck and perhaps by skill. 11 ships in my convoy sank. I watched men die over 6 days of horror. I made it to Archangel with my ship and cargo intact, but I will never forget what I saw. I will never forgive the Admiralty for ordering that scatter, and I will never sail Arctic convoys again. If they court-martial me for refusing duty, so be it. I will not put my life in the hands of commanders who have proven they will sacrifice merchant sailors to protect their own reputations. The Royal Navy's motto is Si vis pacem para bellum. If you want peace, prepare for war. Perhaps they should add, and if you prepare for war, don't send civilian sailors into battle and then abandon them when threats emerge that you should have anticipated. 153 men died because one admiral couldn't think clearly under pressure. That is the truth of Convoy PQ-17. Everything else is justification and excuse. The Atlantic Ocean claimed 153 men in July 1942. The Arctic waters gave them no graves, no monuments, no markers, just cold and darkness and the eternal indifference of the sea. That takes all things eventually and remembers nothing. But we remember them, not as statistics, not as regrettable losses in the course of military operations, but as individual men who trusted their command to make rational decisions and died because that trust was betrayed. Convoy PQ-17, the order that killed 153 sailors and proved that sometimes your own leadership is more dangerous than the enemy you're fighting.